Okay, so let's get started now with formatting 102, I called it. This will be copyright for your dissertation, thesis, or report. I'm Deborah Charlesworth. One of my jobs in the graduate school is to work with students completing these documents. And so welcome to our new people, and thanks for sticking around, all the familiar faces. And people online, feel free to type your questions into the chat, and we will be sure to answer them at the end of the seminar. So again, today we're in our third of 4 seminars. The one that follows this one will be formatting 103, checking and fixing your document. And we'll look at things that you can do in Adobe Acrobat to make sure your document is right the first time. And if it's not, to check and see what types of things you can fix with it. And then we'll have some time at the end as well for any additional questions that maybe we didn't answer throughout the afternoon or that have come up to you as you have thought about things. All seminars are being taped and will be available online sometime later this week. And I'll show you where in just a minute in case you're just joining us. We will talk about finding information and help again. If you're a returnee, this will be familiar, but I want to make sure that anybody who's seeing this for the first time gets the same information. We'll talk about what copyright is, some examples, and how to use materials created by others. Or the most popular question is, how can I use papers that I've published elsewhere? So we will be talking about that in the course of the presentation today. And we'll also talk about fair use. My disclaimer is that this is not legal advice and is only informational in nature. Everything that has to do with copyright, because it's a law, ultimately will be decided in the courts. And so I can give you guidance and information and sort of my understanding of things, but when it comes down to it, if there's a copyright infringement that someone wants to dispute, it would go to the court system and they would decide all that final stuff. And then parts of this presentation were developed by Nora Allred, our university copyright librarian, and so we have jointly presented it sometimes and singly in others, and so we kind of mishmashed everything together into forms that work for each of us. So again, if you have any questions at any time about any aspect of your degree completion, I would encourage you to use the email gradschool@mtu.edu. That is accessible to myself and Nancy and our student staff and other staff in the graduate school. And so it's a way for you to send one email to one person. Don't need to copy anybody else. Everybody that needs to see it will see it, or it will get forwarded if it needs to for some reason. But that will get you to all the people that you need help with. On the web, in our top menu area, the policies and procedures area is really important. That's where you'll find all the forms, upcoming deadlines. The degree completion timeline is a complete detailed list of everything you need to complete your degree. And then because you're here thinking about theses and dissertations and reports, doing any one of those documents, you'll find all of the kind of information that we're talking about today in those websites. On the theses and dissertations website, there is a copyright area, and so that will be where you'll find a lot more of our web information. In the resources for area, there's a current students page. It's really helpful. This is a segment of it that I've screenshotted, but into that professional one in the center, I've boxed in the graduate school seminars, and that's where you'll find this seminar taped, as well as all the slides for today's seminar are already there. So if you are using an electronic device in the room, or if you're online viewing, you can download the slides now if you need those or want them for digital annotation. So why should you care about copyright? Well, first of all, it's a law. So we kind of like to be law-abiding usually. I don't think anybody who really wants to break the law, maybe speeding, we all kind of speed every once in a while, but you know, it's sort of like we know we're not supposed to, you know, that's hopefully not what copyright is. But it's the right thing to do. Copyright is acknowledging that somebody else created something and that you've asked permission to use it. So it's the right thing to do. It's the ethical behavior to have when you're working on your dissertation or thesis. And digital downloads, digital documents, which is what your dissertation, thesis, or report will be, are downloaded a lot more frequently. And so, you know, the likelihood that if you are infringing on somebody's copyright that your work will be found is much higher these days because people are looking at these documents and they can find them. In 2016, we had, you know, almost 150,000 downloads. And that was an average of 88 per document. So it's no longer the case that your dissertation is going to be buried on a shelf somewhere and nobody's going to see it. There potentially are going to be 80 people a year who look at it, and you want things to be done correctly. Now, there are different rules for copyright for using print materials and for the classroom. And we are talking today specifically just about printed works like journal articles, dissertations, theses, and reports. But since many of you could be or are GTAs, I want to make sure I at least mention this because there are some differences. The rules for using things in the classroom are a little more liberal, but they're also more codified. And what that kind of means is there are rules that exist that let you know when it's okay to use things without permission. And some of those include, like if you're running a class on current events, it wouldn't be very current if you saw a newspaper article at 8 o'clock in the morning and had to ask somebody for permission to use it for your 9 a.m. class. It wouldn't be practical. And if it's an educational use and you're in the classroom, there's kind of different rules for that. Now, there are rules and limitations to how much and how often material can be copied. But if you are using materials in the classroom or want to use those, I would encourage you to just Google copyright in the classroom and you'll find lots of different resources about that. But we're going to focus on printed materials today. So what is copyright? We talked already about it's a law, but let's kind of back up and think about property in general. So physical property, examples could be, a car, house, piece of equipment, table, a coffee mug, property, things that I own or somebody owns. And there's laws that govern them. And I can't take a car that I don't own, even if the keys are in it. I mean, I could, but if I started driving down the road in it and the owner came out and saw the car was missing, they'd probably call the police and say, my car's gone. Now, they'd probably be like, why do you have the keys in the ignition? To which the answer might be, well, I live in Houghton. People do that. I don't, but some people do that. But you need permission. So if it's not your car, even if there are keys right there, if somebody's house has the front door wide open, you don't just go, hey, that looks like a nice sofa. I'm going to wander on in and have a rest. If you don't know the person, you're not just going to wander into somebody's open house or use their car. I can't sell my house without my husband's approval. Both of our names are on the deed. There are laws that govern that. He can't just sell out my home under my nose because it's our home. It's not his home, it's ours. Both of our names are on the deed. And I can't damage somebody else's property. So I can't just willy-nilly go, I don't like this tree in your yard, I'm going to chop it down. Or I don't like the color of your front door, so I'm going to paint it. I can't do these things and not expect to get in trouble for them. So there's laws that govern, using physical property. And if we think about physical property as stuff that we can touch and feel and see, intellectual property is property of the mind. So examples include things like, logo for a company or an idea on how to make something, the creative expression of an idea, music, books, television, art, all that stuff is intellectual property. Now, some of it we can touch. A book we can go in the bookstore and buy. But, ultimately, that's kind of the paper it's printed on. What's really important is the words that somebody's taken out of their mind and put on the paper. And so it's not necessarily tangible like a house, but it's still property. It's property of your mind. And so just like physical property, there's laws that govern how intellectual property can be used. I can't just decide to use the Nike swoosh on my new company that I create that sells athletic apparel. Or anything, really. I mean, the Nike swoosh, they don't want anything besides Nike sneakers. If a device is patented, I can't make it without asking the patent holders, may I make this thing? And if they're smart, they'll go, sure, pay me a bunch of money, right? That's what a patent does. A patent says nobody else can make this without my permission. If I wrote a poem, I can't sell it if I didn't write it. So I can't take somebody's poem from a book and sell it to somebody to make a song out of it. I can't post music from my favorite rock band on a public music site for all my friends to download. I mean, I could. I get in a lot of trouble for that, right? Get some people knocking on my door. And so all these things, we can do them. And in some ways, when I was a grad student, which wasn't that long ago, just in case you're wondering. But, in order to get a journal article, I had to walk to the library, pull the book from the shelf, and photocopy it. So the idea of copying and pasting segments of it, or sticking pieces of it in my dissertation, or finding a great figure on a website somewhere and putting it in my dissertation, like we couldn't do that because it didn't exist. So in a lot of ways, this is sort of your generation's learning experience, because there's so much available digitally that looks so beautiful, that's so nice. You're like, oh, well, it's available on the internet. I can just, put this in my dissertation. And the answer is, well, you can. I couldn't, because it was just hard. It was harder to do that than it was to just make it myself. You can copy and put these things in your dissertation, but if the owner finds out, you might get in trouble. So there's 4 types of intellectual property. One is trademarks, one is patents, one is copyright, and one is trade secrets. Trade secrets, like actually the recipe for Coca-Cola. Nobody knows what that is. It's a trade secret. If they patented it, they'd have to tell people what it was, and they don't really want everybody knowing what the recipe for Coca-Cola is. So they actually keep it locked away in a vault, and maybe one person's got part 1 and somebody else has got part 2, and they need both parts to make Coca-Cola. There's those, so that's a trade secret. Patents, then, I think we're all fairly familiar with. Trademarks are the things like the Nike swoosh. What we're going to be talking about today is copyright, which is one form of intellectual property. And that's because it's the most important when talking about dissertations, theses, and reports. So what does copyright protect then? This is one portion of intellectual property. It protects works of authorship. So it protects things like literary works, like your dissertation, like musical works, like the score to a musical, or the sheet music for a song, audiovisual, architecture, anything that's kind of a work of authorship. And in order for it to be a work of authorship, it needs to be original. So it can't just be a copy of something else. So if I go to the library and copy a journal article, I don't own the copyright to it because I have that piece of paper. Like the journal still owns it. A copy of it doesn't have copyright, or isn't copyrightable in its own way. It also has to be creative. And we'll discuss some examples of that. But it has to be something that's creative. And there's a lot of things in science and engineering that aren't very creative because they're just very cut and dry numbers. And so we'll talk about that. It also needs to be fixed. And that means it needs to be written, recorded, filmed, saved to a device, or otherwise captured. So that means that things on the internet are copyrighted if they are original and creative. So just because it's on a website that somebody's built in their spare time, maybe it's a WordPress blog or a Google site or whatever, if it's written and it's on the web, it's still copyrighted. A lot of people have the misconception that just because it's on the website, it must mean it's just free to use. It's not. It's copyrighted, and you need to think about whether you can use it before you can use it. What's not protected is things like ideas. So like the idea of how to make a better hip replacement. If I actually come up with a way to manufacture a better one and patent it, then that's protected. But an idea that we should make a different coating on a hip replacement to make it last longer in somebody's body is not something that we can copyright. Facts. The earth is round. I guess unless you're a flat earth person, but that's a whole nother debate we won't get into. Discoveries. Data. So like the data that you collect, the data itself is not copyrightable because there's nothing unique, there's nothing original or creative about it. It's just the numbers that you get. Sorry, Moose, I didn't mean to make you laugh. So for example, the idea of Vikings invading Mars is not protected, but a novel about that is. If we had the idea of a bunch of friends in New York living and loving and working, that's not copyrightable. But the script to Friends or Seinfeld or Will and Grace or any one of a million shows that are set in New York City with a bunch of weird, wacky friends doing something weird and wacky, that's the copyrightable part. Facts, like dates and holidays on a calendar, are not copyrightable. So if somebody just kind of gives you a calendar and sticks all the dates and holidays on it, that's not copyrightable. But if you start to put imagery into it and have like a Bridge of Michigan calendar or, Blizzard T Husky throughout the US And every month has got a different picture of Blizzard and little anecdotes from Blizzard all through the calendar. That's copyrightable. Data in a table is not copyrightable. So a listing of numbers is not something you copyright. However, if it's an original and creative way to present the data, then it can be copyrighted. There are exceptions. So libraries get licenses to use things, to reuse them. And these terms of license can override or build on copyright. So maybe your own published works have a license to be published by a journal, but they allow you to reuse it in your dissertation. There's licensing that goes into that. And we'll talk more about what that means for your papers particularly. You might also have seen a lot of Creative Commons licenses. So somebody might publish a blog or a YouTube video on the Creative Commons license. And usually those then spell out, well, where can I reuse this material? What do I want other people to do with it? Because a lot of people want to create things to share. That's how we create some new and wonderful things. You know, music sampling is a great thing if you have, you know, the right ability to do it. I mean, we create some wonderful pieces of music by, you know, doing sampling and mixing and matching and using different bass beats from this music and putting it in that music. I mean, there's lots of things that we can do if we can have that sharing license. There are also things that are in the public domain. So they might be very creative, but somebody just says right away, I don't care if other people use it. I want them to use it. I just give free rein to anybody to use it. And things like that are things with expired copyright. So particularly our social sciences students, if you're working on things that's very, very old, you know, maybe a journal from a minor back in the 1880s, copyright's probably expired by now. And there's tools where you can find out if it has or not. But there's things like that where the copyright's expired. Works that are created by the US federal government, federal being different than state, things created by the federal government are also automatically copyright free. The rationale being that we all paid for them to make those things, so we should get to use them. We all paid our taxes this year, hopefully. If you didn't, there's a whole other problem coming up for you. Copyright talk is the least of your worries, but as long as you paid your taxes, you paid for this stuff, you get to use it. And there's things that people can just make permission free. So what are some common examples then that you might encounter in your dissertation, thesis, or report? One thing might be a simple data table. So this table just lists a whole bunch of data about a material, melting point, modulus, et cetera, Nothing creative about this. If I gave each of you this data table and said, make a new data table, you'd probably look at me like I was crazy and go, it's going to look just like this. There's nothing creative about it. Nobody else would create something totally different from it. So this table is not what I would consider a creative expression of data. And so if I were to retype that into my dissertation and provide the appropriate citations to indicate that where it came from, I would consider that, generally people would consider that not to be copyrightable, and that you could just cite that material and use it in your dissertation or thesis with no additional stuff to go on. We can also have simple graphs. Sometimes when students come to my office, I'll give them some data. I'll just make up something. And I'll say, make a graph of this. And then I'll turn my back to them, I'll make another graph. And if we did that with this data, chances are pretty good it would look just like this plot. You know, we're all trained, if you're a scientist or engineer, pretty much we're all trained to make graphs the same way. You have to have an x-axis that's labeled with your units and your numbers. You have to have a y-axis that's labeled with your units and your numbers. You got to put some symbol on it. You know, maybe I'd use a triangle and you'd use a circle, but not a whole lot else would probably be different about this. So again, data is not copyrightable. This figure is not horribly creative and generally is not considered to be copyrighted. So the general rule of thumb is for something like this, you could use this, generally speaking, without any additional permissions because it's just not considered original or unique enough to be copyrighted. Now we start to get a little more complicated though. Now here we have a graph, but it's got some data, it's got photographs, it's got some labels, and you might be able to do this in a different way. And for one of these papers from Keith, I actually did this figure. I did like the first one in the group. Because I'm like, oh, we could put this figure on here and make the graph. And they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. You just do it. And I had the knowledge of how to use Excel to make enough blank space to put the scratch underneath. And so this is a scratch going along a nano indentation sample and a composite. And they were measuring the penetration during the scratch as it went along. And it showed some stuff about the composite, whether it was fiber rich or all that kind of stuff. And so I use my creativity to crop the scratch, to get the right scratch, to plot it against the data. And there's a little more effort in there. Now, some people might say, well, that's still not too creative. So now we're getting into a gray area. But in general, I would say this is probably more of a creative expression, copyrighted. And therefore, before you put this in your dissertation or thesis, you should figure out if you're allowed to using copyright law. The other common one then would be a photograph, maybe a micrograph of a sample, an SEM photo, or maybe a photograph that I took on my vacation. And this is generally then super creative because now we're talking about the composition, the camera settings, the angle. I could do different exposures. I could maybe take this into Photoshop and do some crazy stuff with it. There's all sorts of things that you could think about with photos. Even with an SEM photo, I mean, you have to think about what's the working distance, what's the working voltage, how did I coat that sample, what was the voltage that I used to get that, the electron. You could think about all those different parameters. And so it's one person given the same sample might come up with a completely different looking photo. And you're also picking and choosing the area, right? You're going to go in this area and somebody else is going to go over there. And everyone's going to pick and choose what part of the sample they think best represents the idea they're trying to do. So now you've got some creativity. You've got somebody who's thinking about how can I present my science in a way that will be creative and get my point across and show all these wonderful things. So again, photographs we would consider to be copyrighted. And in order to use those in your document, you should take some care. Software screenshots most usually are considered copyrighted. I've had extensive conversations with the library on this, and we both agree on this, but there's lots of images in here that I didn't create. There's a layout to all of these that I did not create. I'm not Microsoft. I didn't create any of this. So if you're going to use a screenshot like this in a printed work, you need to think about this. So those are kind of the 5 most common things I see people besides papers, which we'll talk about as a separate thing. So how would I use these materials that are created by others, or maybe that I created myself, but are now copyrighted by somebody else? So can you use these things? Well, only if you have permission. If you didn't create them yourself, first of all, that's the first rule of it. And that includes your own published work, like things like journal articles and conference proceedings, or work created by somebody else, or things from the internet. Now, first of all, you always have to cite the original source. If you don't, that's plagiarism. And that's kind of related to copyright, but sort of separate. So always cite. So step number 1 is always cite. And that's a scholarly expectation. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone here. And this even applies to your own work. And I give you a tip if you're still writing your dissertation proposal, or if you're even writing your dissertation. If you're writing something that's related to your advisor's previous work, cite your advisor wherever you can. Just lots of places. Just find places. They like it. One of my colleagues in grad school, he hadn't cited his advisor in his whole dissertation proposal. And his whole work was based on what his advisor had done before him. And he's like, why didn't you cite me anywhere in here? He goes, well, I thought you knew all that stuff already. He's like, well, I do, but you're building on it. You need to cite it. So just cite your advisor a bunch of times. It'll make them feel good. And it applies to your own work. So if you've published your own work somewhere else, you should be citing it. And the reason for that is The citation shows that your dissertation is not the first time it's been published. Anything that's not cited in your dissertation, people are going to say, oh, this is the first time it's been published. So that's why your citation is necessary. Even if it's a journal article or a conference proceeding, it shows that it was presented somewhere else. And so somebody could go, oh, I want to look at that abstract because maybe somebody else in that same session presented a paper that I'm also interested in. It helps people find more research and literature. If you're doing a figure or table, the citation should be in the text, so in the body where you're typing, see figure 1, but it should also be in your caption. When you think about a figure or table, the caption with that item should allow them both to stand on their own. So you shouldn't need to read the text to find out where it came from. If somebody were to photograph that page or scan it, and kind of pass it to their friend and go, oh, this is a great figure, they should kind of know that it didn't come from that material. So step 1, always cite. Citation is not sufficient though. The citation says that your document's not the first place it's ever been. That's what it tells you. It also, avoids allegations of plagiarism, assuming that you've rewritten any printed words if you're copying and pasting a block of text. But it doesn't give you permission to use the material. It's like having the keys to a friend's car. Just because you have the keys doesn't mean you can host a wild party at their house or take their car on a 500-mile joyride. You probably still have to ask them permission. Hey, I got your keys. We have friends we have friends that have keys to our house. It's so in case something happens that we can call them up and go, hey, I'm locked out, or I'm out of town, can you check on the boiler? It's not so they can come into our house whenever they feel like it. It's for us. It's for convenience. So after you've cited something, the next thing to do is to determine if permission is needed. And so I would direct you to the guide. We talked about that in the last session, but it's in the formatting area of our website. That's the governing document for all the requirements for a thesis, dissertation, or report. And it gives you more information about if permission is needed. Permission is not needed for things that are in the public domain, if the copyright's expired, fair use, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or things that you have substantially altered from their original source. If you've substantially made it your own creative work, you also don't need permission. You just need to acknowledge the original source. And then papers, again, we'll talk about papers in a little more detail, where you have retained the right to republish. So do I need permission is the next step when using materials. If you do, then you get it. The guide has a little bit more information on that, and I'll refer you to that. Permission needs to be in writing. Email is fine. Fax is fine. A paper letter is fine. Any of those things are considered in writing. What's not in writing is your friend telling you in the hallway that you can use that figure. And what I found is that, as silly as this might seem for some things, I have examples where students have put something in their thesis. They've asked somebody, can I put this in there? They go, yeah, sure, no problem. And then they go, oh, the grad school wants a letter. Will you write me a letter? What are you doing with this? It's my thesis. Where's it going to be? In the library. Can anybody see it? Sure. I don't like this anymore. And they'll actually retract their verbal permission. Because, I don't know, somehow the act of writing a letter for a couple people, once in a while, not saying it's everybody, but every once in a while this happens. The thing is, if this happens and you ask somebody to write a letter and they say no, you don't really want their stuff in your thesis, because they're the ones that are going to find it online and go, hey, I didn't know this was going to be online and available to anybody, and they're going to cause you trouble later. So it's better to ask for the permission, get the letters in writing, and be sure that you've got all that material in order. If you do want to include those papers in your dissertation, which we would encourage you to do and would ask that you do that, if there's signatures in them and you want to put them in your dissertation, you do need to redact them, and we'll talk about how to do that in the next seminar on Acrobat. But a redaction means that they're obscured or hidden, and that will help prevent identity theft. You can also upload things to Digital Commons and ProQuest so that they're not public, but they're just part of your electronic submission. If you do that, it doesn't matter if the signatures are in there or not. And then step 4, once you've gotten permission or determined that you didn't need it, is to document for each of the items that you can reprint them. Figure 1 is public domain. See this website. Figure 2 has a letter. Here's the letter. Figure 3 is I have the right to republish it. Here's the copyright transfer agreement. Your rights holder will sometimes say they want a special line that says with kind permission from Springer Verlag, with kind thoughtfulness from Wiley. You know, they all have their own little thing they might want. And then we would ask that you would send all that documentation to the graduate school with your final submission so that it's all together and available for us to review. So the documentation can be permission letters in writing or documentation that's in the public domain. We don't know just by looking at it that you've made that determination. It's fair use. We don't know that just by looking at it. Has expired copyright. So your documentation can be all sorts of things. It might just be an explanation that all of these things are in the public domain because they're created by US government employees. It could be a sentence. We would ask you to organize that documentation. We would suggest again that it's either an appendix to your document or an upload to Digital Commons or ProQuest. And they should each be labeled. As I kind of said earlier, you know, figure 1 is public domain because of X, figure 2 has a letter. You know, someone should be able to see from your list of documentation what it refers to in your document. It shouldn't just be a whole lump of letters that you've stuck together and go, here it is. You know, your reader is going to want to know, well, what is this for? Why is this here? And then remove your signatures. So cite your materials. Determine if you need permission, if it's something that's copyrighted or copyrightable. Determine if somebody needs to be asked permission. Get permission if you need it. And then put all of that documentation, whether it's a permission letter or an explanation, together in a PDF or a couple different uploads, whatever makes sense for your work. Now, what about papers that you've already published? Many, many students do this. Many, many students will have 4 papers published, 2, 3 papers published, conference proceedings, and they'll want to just take that and make that chapter 3. So for the purposes of our thesis or dissertation, when you look at the guide, a published material is things that are in print, accepted for publication, in review, or planned for submission. Now the only things that require copyright documentation are the things that are in print, because everything else is still copyrighted to you until you've sent it off to the journal and it's become a printed piece. So can you use a paper? Of course you can, but only if you have permission or when you published it with the publisher, they let you reuse it in your dissertation or thesis. And we'll talk about where you find that out in a bit. So again, this includes your own published work, journal articles, conference proceedings, works published by others, all that kind of stuff. So if you've published all this already, it still applies. So always cite, and you're going to repeat steps 1 through 4. The difference being with step 2, when you publish an article in a journal, you or your advisor on your behalf signs what's known as a copyright transfer agreement. The journal cannot print your copyrighted work without asking for your permission. And so a copyright transfer agreement is their way of asking, okay, dear author, you've submitted your work to us. May we please print it in our journal? And so that's an agreement that you have with the journal. And that agreement spells out then what you can and can't do with the paper after you've published it. If you don't have anything in there that says you can republish it, then you would need to obtain permission and document the ability to reprint, just like for the other items. So what is that copyright transfer agreement? As I've already kind of started talking about, it is an agreement that you sign that gives the journal the ability to print your work, or conference, et cetera, et cetera. And so read them carefully. They're often available online to read before you sign them. Many publishers also will have on their website something called an author rights agreement, which will tell you for all the journals published by Elsevier or Wiley or somebody else what they allow authors to redo. You're bound to these agreements even if you don't sign them. So back in the old days when I was a grad student, everyone had to sign them on paper. And so we kind of walked around the lab. And when you're signing something on paper, you tend to kind of look at it. Like, what am I doing? What am I signing away? What am I getting myself into here? Nowadays, a lot of them are kind of these click-through agreements. Like when you submit your dissertation to Digital Commons, you click through an agreement. My guess is that probably 90% of the students don't read the agreement. You really should read the agreement. It's important. But you're bound by those rules, whether or not you've read them or not. Most of them do say right in the documentation, it's okay to reprint this in your thesis. And if it says that, you don't need to do anything else special. So a lot of students kind of spend a lot of time getting these permissions. And I'm like, well, did you look at the copyright transfer agreement? Because it probably said you could do this already. Like, oh, I didn't know that existed. So take a minute to look those up. Now with your own papers, if you're taking a paper, and again, if it's published, in press, submitted, thinking about submitting, this is a rule that would apply. You would need a footnote for each chapter to say, this paper is published in, this paper is planned for submission to, whatever the status of that is when you're taking that whole chapter as a journal article. You would also add a preface to your document. We will be doing a revision of the guide, and the preface will be renamed the author contribution statement. So this is kind of similar to what a lot of journals do, where when you submit the article, you'll say like what all the contributions of the authors were. And that's what the preface has always been. We're just going to rename it so it actually kind of matches what's going in there. It wasn't quite as clear as we wanted it to be. And contributions include things like writing the paper, analyzing the data, planning the experiments, collecting the data, maybe revising the paper. I'll have students who come into my office and go, well, I'm the one who did it. Well, who are your co-authors? My advisor. Will the advisor do anything? No. Well, did he provide you the lab equipment? Well, yeah. Did he give you some instruction on how to use the equipment? Yeah. Did he look at your data while you were collecting it and talk about how it's going to be interpreted and what you're going to do with it? Yeah, they did that. Well, those are contributions. So you might have been the one writing the paper and collecting all the data, but contributions can be intellectual and not necessarily like, so your advisor most likely is a contributor. And so writing a little sentence about what they did is a good idea. So what is fair use? Fair use is the other kind of exception to things that don't need permission. Fair use allows you to use some copyrighted materials without asking for permission. It's a 4-factor test. The factors are purpose, nature, amount, and market. It's case by case, ambiguous by design, like most of the federal government appears to be when writing laws. And it's meant to allow some freedom and flexibility, but also to not be kind of entirely clear about things. And so this is where you'll see court cases. I think Ed Sheeran was in the news recently because somebody thinks he copied a piece of music from somebody. There was another one recently about a sampling of Stairway to Heaven and whether or not it was appropriate to use that or not. So you've all probably heard of different people in the news about sampling music. That's kind of the popular one that kind of gets out there. And somebody will say, well, it's fair use. Like it's just a drum beat. It's like a measure. It's a limited amount. It's not a big deal. I'm actually creating a better market for that piece of music because once they hear that bass beat in my music, they're going to want to buy their music. And they'll go through these 4 factors and they'll say, it's fair use. And the person who wrote it will go, no, it's not fair use. And then they'll go to courts and they'll decide. So let's say, for example, here is a picture. And let's say that somebody else took the picture. I'm guessing I put a timer on this one. I don't think we would have just given our camera to some random guy in London, but I think it was a timer. But there's a picture. Creative, unique, copyrighted, all that kind of good stuff. So if I wanted to use that in my dissertation, we would look at the purpose of the use. Is it transformative? Am I creating new knowledge? Am I making the world a better place? This is typically where education stuff goes, yep, it's transformative. How much am I using? Is it the whole thing? Is it part of it? You can't have a book review typically without copying some portion of the text to illustrate the language that the author is using. Maybe there's a particular sentence in the introduction that really tells the reader of your book review like what kind of language and tone they're using. But if I take the punchline out of the, if it's a murder mystery and in the book review I tell you who murdered the person, no one's going to want to buy the book. So fair use allows me to take that sentence in the first paragraph to say this is a really beautiful book, but it doesn't let me take the last sentence of the book where it says who did it and do that. So that wouldn't be fair use. Fair use would not be taking the last sentence where I destroy all possibility of anyone buying the book. So how much is used and how important? Are you borrowing from fact or fiction? This is where a lot of people get stuck because this is the nature, it's educational, it's fiction, it's factual, it's an educational thing. And there's a heavy leaning in that category if it's educational and factual based that it is okay to use that in an educational manner. However, that's only one of the 4 factors. So you can't ignore all the other ones and go, well, they don't matter at all. The other one is potential effect for the copyrighted work. So again, if I steal that last sentence of the book, if I put that in my book review and nobody wants to buy the book, and I've destroyed the whole market, it doesn't matter that I've only taken 1 sentence out of it. I've destroyed the market for this book. Now I can't use that anymore. If I think about my photograph and I'm trying to put it in my thesis on bridge design, well, it's transformative. I'm, not using a whole lot of bridge pictures from this person. I'm, factually based. I'm not depriving them of selling that photo. And so you kind of have to look through all of those. And some of them may be weighted in one direction or the other. If you're going to be using fair use as an argument for your copyrighted works, we have some tools on our website that I would recommend you use. One of them is called the Fair Use Evaluator. And what it does for you is it'll go through all 4 of those factors in a much better way than I've done in the 2 minutes that I have allotted for today. And it will kind of explain to you, okay, factor 1 means this. And write up something about what you think about factor 1 and how strong is it for one way or the other. And at the end of each 4 factors, once you've done it, it'll say, okay, based on how you answered, we think this use is fair and would recommend that fair use is appropriate. And if you go through it and you weight it all the other way and goes, well, we think this use is not fair, then you would need to ask for permission to reuse the material. It's not absolute. This is, again, not legal advice, but it's a good tool to use to kind of work through whether or not you think something is fair use or not. So there are a lot of helpful links and resources. I would really point you mostly to our website. I'm just going to go there real quick. But in that policies and procedures area for theses and dissertations, we have the using copyrighted materials, and we have this how to use copyrighted materials, which is kind of going through the 1 through 4. But this online seminar here, then, this is actually, I think the video still works. If it doesn't, we can do it again. We got the slides, so some of these you'll see where I got copied things. But here's the copyright crash course, the fair use evaluator, all those sorts of tools are there. If you think that your work is in the public domain, this is a tool that tells you whether or not the copyright's expired based on when it was created. So we've got a lot of these kind of web resources. The library has recommended these to us, and if you look on their website, they also have similar resources as well. So those are, actually their copyright resources are supposed to be there too. So there's the copyright for the library. So they have instructional things there. So if you're looking for copyright in the classroom for Michigan Tech, you can look there. So what about your dissertation, thesis, or report? You are the sole author of it. Your name is on the title page, which means you own the copyright to it. Except, if some of it's been published, somebody else owns the copyright to those parts, and your copyright transfer agreement outlines the rights you still have. So if you want to take your dissertation that's unpublished and publish it in a journal, it's a copyrighted work, but essentially you need to ask yourself permission to reprint. So as long as you don't argue with yourself about whether or not you can reprint it, you're good to go. Because a lot of students will ask you, well, now that it has copyright on the front page, does that mean I can't reprint it? No, it just means you have to ask yourself permission to reprint it, and hopefully you'll give yourself permission. You can file your copyright. If you file your copyright, it gives you additional protection if your work has been infringed upon. I would recommend filing copyright if you're thinking that your dissertation, thesis, or report may end up as a book at some point in the future. If you're planning on publishing in journal articles, copyright filing doesn't really give you a lot of great protections because once it's published in the journal, it's published, and usually that happens, within a year or two after you've finished. But there have been a number of cases where students who wanted to print their dissertation as a book had their copyright infringed on because somebody kind of beat them to the punch almost. If you're doing a report, you have to file it on your own. If you're doing a dissertation or thesis, you can file it on your own, or you can do that with ProQuest for a $55 fee. Apparently I didn't mute all my devices, sorry. I think it's one of those junk calls that we all love to answer. Turnitin.com. It's not related to copyright so much, but people ask me questions about this, so we'll talk about Turnitin.com. Turnitin.com is plagiarism detection software. So it's kind of one way you can figure out if you've copied and pasted too much text from a journal article that you might have needed copyright permission for. And what it does is it compares your document to what it has in its database. And so that might be web pages, journal articles, et cetera, et cetera. It won't tell you what its sources are, because if it did, then you could just game the system. So, asking Turnitin.com exactly which journals are indexed isn't going to help you any. What the report will do, it will show you what text in your document matches a source in its database and what source it was. And it doesn't mean that it's plagiarized, it just means it matches. So you will often find phrases that are very common in your field that will match throughout your whole document, and that's perfectly okay. But when you start to see whole sentences or 2 or 3 sentences in a row that match, now you've got a problem. When you use the graduate school site to submit your work, we do have it set up in as private a way as possible, in that your work is not stored on the Turnitin.com database for comparison to other people's work. Of course, it has to get uploaded somehow to do its magic, but it's not stored for future comparison to other work. Only graduate school staff who are authorized will have access to your document, and we don't look at them unless you ask us to. So if you want us to look at page 3 and what that match in paragraph 4 because you're not sure what that means, we're happy to do that for you, but we won't do that unless you ask us to. So how can you access it? It's on Turnitin. It's on Canvas. You'll click on the modules in the left-hand menu of the graduate candidates course. So there's a graduate candidates course that each student is enrolled in. And in that course, you click on the modules to find it. And there's 3 Turnitin.com assignments. They're labeled 1, 2, 3. What it means is you can submit 3 today. And if 3 is not sufficient for you, I will refresh them, or I can refresh them once per year. Because the idea is we're making this available as a resource, particularly for your dissertation or thesis, so you can maybe upload that pre-defense copy, make sure everything looks good. If you make some revisions to it, you want to make sure that the revisions are okay, and then you have kind of one spare one. It's not meant for you to sequentially and serially submit every single piece of work you've ever done. And if you need more than that, what you should be doing is asking your advisor for assistance. Because if you need them for a class, you should ask your instructor. If you need them for other reasons, you can use these for anything you want. We just are limiting it so that it's kind of not a tool that you can be abused. So we won't submit it for you, but we can help you in interpreting the results if you need help. So the bottom line, cite all your sources. Make sure you obtain permission if you're using stuff that's copyrighted, that's not your own work, or that is your own work and published somewhere. Document that you have the ability to reprint all the items. And there's really a lot more to it. I think copyright is pretty fascinating. I mean, if you start to pay attention to the news, you'll find some really interesting cases that are fascinating to kind of read how people interpret it. And it really is subject to interpretation. So I'm giving you advice and information, but there's no kind of right or wrong, black and white answers in this area. So I know students get very frustrated with me because they're like, I always say it depends. And that's pretty much my stock answer with all of them, but it really does depend on your use. Okay. So questions, again, if you're online, more than welcome to type a question in the chat.